Well, Mr. Williams, if it's convenient for you, you could continue now.
Yes, sir. So I've now got Mr. Rees with me, so you should have his evidence. And again, assuming we'll just turn directly to questions.
Good afternoon, Mr. Rees.
Afternoon.
Are there any corrections or updates that you need to make to this evidence or summary?
No.
Very well, thank you. We'll go straight to questions then. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen.
Yes, thank you. Just your evidence in chief, paragraph 46. Last sentence, in the case of serious non-compliance, irrigation water can be withheld. Has that ever happened?
No, but it has been seriously considered.
Paragraph 49, and you were here this morning?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so you would have heard me ask Mr. Walton's questions about this, which I remain confused on.
Yep.
WI does not share the individual nitrogen loss numbers with its shareholders, but yet they all do annual nutrient budgets using overseer, so I'm at a loss to understand what you're trying to tell us.
Yeah. No, fine. So if we can explain it a bit better. So the nitrogen loss numbers that is referred to that we do not tell them is the nitrogen loss per farm in the consent. So the consent has a schedule of properties with an NDA attached to it, and that is the number that we are not divulging, mainly to probably keep the continuous improvement going really. And when they do their numbers that they do on farm, that's an annual actual nitrogen loss, and so they do know that. So that's the difference between the two numbers.
And so the schedule and the consent, so is that, explain what that schedule is? Yeah.
So the schedule is based on the MRB numbers. So,
okay.
So the MRB files are representative of different farm systems with different climate and different soils. Yeah.
So that was the MRB numbers at the time consent was applied for? So
Yes.
is that like a point in time back then?
They have been updated though with the version changes with overseer as well, so they are continually relevant. Yep.
And so does the schedule and the consent get continuously updated?
Yes.
Okay. And how do those numbers compare with the overseer numbers that the farmers generate themselves?
They vary, and they vary with unders and overs. And I suppose Mr. Ford's evidence as well around the particular numbers show a big picture, whereas if you go to on a farm basis, depending on the farming system, depending on the MRB numbers, there are some unders and some overs. So that's partly the reason why we didn't share the numbers with them, the inconsistency that the modelling is thrown up. As a scheme, it works well.
Which are the more accurate numbers?
Accuracy is based around the in-loss actual, I guess, depending what you're wanting accuracy to what. I mean, the accuracy to the consent numbers is the MRB, whereas accuracy on a yearly basis is the actuals which they do every year.
So which would best represent actual in-losses from a farm, the overseer annual budget or the MRB numbers?
The actual in-losses for every year.
So the overseer budgets that the farmers do themselves?
Yes, the actual budgets, yes.
Okay. Just one other question at your 104. Just the second half of that para, ongoing reductions in in-loss would not be the priority in terms of improving their environmental performance. Can you just expand on that a little bit more? So why would they not be a priority and what would be a priority?
Yep. That's a good question. The reason why that is there, the context is that often in-loss is associated with groundwater, whereas any particular property may have other issues, surface water issues or things like that, which may be the focus for them to improve on in the first instance. In particular, we've got properties with the Cusp River running through them and some fencing off of drains or fencing off of spring heads and things like that would probably be better where the best bang for buck is, I guess, in terms of the money spent.
Yeah.
So I guess the whole water quality thing is predicated on a range of measures, not just nitrogen. So when you look at the water quality within streams, within spring heads, there's runoff, there's E. coli, there's phosphorus, and I guess one of the reasons that we'll suggest a solutions package is it covers all potential contaminants and all aspects of water quality. So it's a broader suite than just N, which is what the PC7 focuses on.
Yeah. And so that might include biodiversity as well?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, the biodiversity originally came out of Mangakai from the Farm Environment Plan and the audits requirement. And we looked at that and recognised that it probably wasn't, well, the Mangakai in particular wasn't well enough understood across the scheme. And again, as shareholders, they didn't know what they were trying to protect. So that was one of the reasons why we really sort of took the initiative and really tried to figure out what it is that is of value.
And I take it from your evidence you have a lot of interaction with the shareholders.
Yes.
And we've heard from the overall case of Will is that there's a willingness to implement the 2030 N-loss reductions that are in PC7.
Yes.
What's your view on the level of farmer commitment to that?
They're all committed to improve environmental performance, and that's why, again, if you bring it back up into water quality, as in there's many aspects to it, the 15% reduction is one aspect to it, and once we have conveyed it to them and communicated to them the importance of it, which we are, they will be on board. And I mean, certainly over the last 5 years that I've been involved with the WIL scheme and with farmer good practice in general, there's been a real shift in attitude and engagement of these farmers to actually make improvements. And it's, certainly the overseer focus and the understanding that provides the annual budgets is useful for that. So they will, I have no doubt that they will be looking to do it. And the whole suite of measures around the National Environmental Standards, the 190 rule, all those sorts of things are all going to help. Yeah. So they've certainly turned their heads, yeah.
All right, thanks very much. That was all.
Okay.
Commissioner Solomon?
Yes, I just have a couple of questions for Mr. Rees. You mentioned before about if the overseer number shows that their in-loss is on track or improving, are you saying that with regard to farmers discontinuing to manage or to undertake good management practices? Yes,
so I suppose the in-loss numbers are an indication of practice. They're an indication of the modelling of the farm use, and it's a measure of resource use efficiency as well. So really, the whole concept of continuous improvement, that's one aspect of it which we can show in terms of modelling and show how they are improving. And the whole, certainly the regen program that we put together, the use of soil moisture monitoring has had a big impact in that. So that's one measure that we use to show they are improving. Does that answer your question?
Not quite. Let me help clarify or explain or ask my question better.
Yep.
I think before you said that you withhold the consent information pertaining to overseer and nutrient loss.
Yes.
Because you want to encourage farmers to continually improve. If they saw a really good result in the overseer, would they stop undertaking good management practices?
No. I see your point. No, it's. I guess you're referring to have they got a target? Is this what you're trying to get at?
Well, no, I've just picked up on what you said.
Yep. So it is again one measure. If they're showing improvement, then they're probably going to want to continue improving. I don't think that getting to a number is going to be the be-all and end-all for them. Certainly there's always opportunity to better use resources, and nitrogen is one of those resources that they use. So if they get a good result, will they stop? No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And regarding the Mahinga Kai objective that you mentioned before, and the farmers not understanding what that meant, and so you took initiative to. What did you do in taking the initiative?
Well, that's what we did there. We just basically looked at the scheme in general and worked out what biodiversity there was and wasn't, and what it is that farmers need to protect on their properties and at a scheme and at a district level. As well as that, we've been doing some training. We've got another training in February, I think, around Mahinga Kai, so that's in combination with Environment Canterbury. And really it was just to try and give them some context around what it is that Mahinga Kai means. And no disrespect, there is a lack of understanding of it in general, and you're probably well aware of that.
I can appreciate that.
Yeah. So that was really when I started this off, I wanted to get an understanding of what it meant for farmers on the ground, and that biodiversity was the first cab off the rank, I guess, to say here's what we need to protect.
So did that training that Environment Canterbury helped undertake, did that have support from Te Ngātua Huriri?
Yeah, I think Makariri was the man doing it, and I presume he did have, so yeah. Yeah.
Well, he's from Te Ngātua, so, and he's a very good person. In your paragraph 13, you talk about consequences if environment performance does not meet. Can you explain what some of those consequences might be?
Yes. So as environment performance is measured basically through the farm environment plan and the audit process, and through that process the farmers are given a grade, A, B, C or D, and also we look at what makes up that grade is a whole bunch of targets around particular management areas. So if there is an area where they have a lower level of confidence target, we would suggest some training. We would suggest that, and there's usually some actions in the audits to improve infrastructure or improve management around those. And then, so the consequence of poorer performance is basically a revisit or a shorter time frame to actually reassess them.
Okay, and my last question, and it's at your paragraph 33 where it talks about audited, I presume it's audited farm environment plans.
Yes.
And I don't know if you've read Miss Kylie Hall's evidence on behalf of Te Rūrango Ngaitahu and Ngārunanga, but in her evidence she lists some misgivings of FEPs, including, and just bear with me while I read them out, they're not statutory documents and no enforcement can be applied to non-complying landowners, even though they acknowledge that non-complying landowners are for the most part in the minority. Yep. The content and quality and auditing of FEP varies substantially depending on the author. The willingness of landowners to incorporate good management practices and the qualifications and expertise of the auditor, particularly with regard to cultural values, is not widely known, as you've expressed with Mahinga Kai, as a number of submissions have alluded to during this hearing. And finally, protection of some cultural values requires a specialist understanding, which is not often held by farm or farm auditors. And I can use the example of rock art, and, because it does take specialist understanding to manage those values. Do you have a view on any of these misgivings, given your experience with auditing farm environment plans?
Yes. I'll try and deal with each of them in isolation. So no statutory requirement. There is requirement through the Environment Canterbury Land and Water Regional Plan for farms with various thresholds to have a farm environment plan. So that is in itself in there, and also as part of our audited self-management program, that is a key part of the enforcement of the requirements. The no enforcement, well, obviously we do enforce through our scheme, because obviously we have make sure that everyone has a farm environment plan and also an audit that goes along with it. That's a non-negotiable for the scheme. The content and quality varies. Yes, I would agree with that, and that's often comes down to the advice that is given to a farmer to put it in. And again, farm environment plans are very much a risk assessment, and often farmers need some help to identify the risks and then to manage them. So they are valid points, but I guess from where Waimakariri Irrigation sit, is that they have engaged myself, I suppose, as an expert, and I'm very much aware of how these processes are supposed to be put together. My previous employment was with Irrigation New Zealand, and I was heavily involved with the Farm Environment Plan program, I guess, when it first was started back in 2012. I think it was after the first MPS around the freshwater stuff. So that, for me, we have that, well, I can see we have it well covered. We are actually not sitting our laurels there either. We're about to undergo a environmental management strategy review, which will probably include the Farm Environment Plan to make sure it's still fit for purpose, because even certainly around the cultural stuff, things have moved and does need to be included and updated. So willingness of landholders, can you remind me very quickly what that point was?
The willingness of landholders to incorporate good management practices and the qualifications and expertise of the auditor, particularly with regard to cultural values, is not widely known.
Yep.
And I guess what you're saying is with more training and more learning and being receptive to that learning will probably solve that problem.
Yeah, definitely. Certainly the willingness of landholders, as I've said, for the last 5 years, I've definitely seen a mind shift across farming in general. And it takes time to turn people's heads, but once they're turned, they certainly get into it. The qualification of the auditors, again, that's an Environment Canterbury initiative, and they are working hard to continue to upskill and make sure our auditors fit the bill. Again, we're just about to, we're invigorating our audit program, and we're actually just gone out to the market, about to go to the market, should I say, to look at options for auditing for the scheme.
And what about the last bullet point, the specialist understanding?
Of cultural. Yep, and I guess that's where lots of Waimakariri and that comes into play. So yes, that's possibly an area we can improve on, and not through want of trying.
No.
Often there are resources that are lacking, and that's because it is probably so a lesser understood area. So yep, fair points.
Good. Thank you. I have no more questions.
Well, Mr. Rees, it's a satisfaction that you've come and given us these answers to our questions and your update of your evidence. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And we'll now turn to Ms. Sullivan. I think Commissioner Shepherd may have indicated at the beginning he had no questions for Ms. Sullivan, but I'm assuming the other commissioners may, or maybe Commissioner Shepherd does have questions now.
Well, good afternoon, Ms. Sullivan.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for coming in, and thank you for your update summary, which is very clear, and we're grateful for that. Is there anything further that you want to bring us up to date with before we come to questions, if any?
No, I think everything's covered.
Thank you. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
Yeah, just two matters. The first one's at para 13 of your primary evidence.
Of the summary, did you say?
No, the primary evidence. Paragraph 13, page 3.
Yep.
So you say there the last sentence, linking the stage reductions to achievement of water quality outcomes. I just want to confirm there that you're referring to the water quality outcomes in tables 8.5 to 8.8 of the plan change?
Yes, that's correct. Yep.
Yeah, okay. And just one more at para 44. So again, this is a consistent theme in my questioning. Second and third lines, WIL is unable to determine the individual nitrogen baselines for its shareholders, and we've established they do annual nitrogen budgets using overseer. Does that comment there relate to the baseline period, 09 to 13?
Yes, this is the 09 to 13 baseline.
Yeah. Okay.
And by that I'm referring to they're unable to determine overseer baselines, hence the use of the MRB numbers for the baselines. Yep.
And is that just because that 09, 013 period is some time ago and they just don't have that info anymore?
That's the reason. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think that's reasonably common, particularly now across a lot of schemes and other farms within Canterbury. That they just don't have the records, and farms have often changed hands. Various other changes have gone on.
Yeah. Right, thanks. That was all I wanted to ask you about.
Commissioner Sullivan.
Yes, I just have a couple of questions for Ms Sullivan. At your paragraph 16B in your evidence in chief, can you please remind me why the word minimised has been replaced with mitigated when originally we asked for mitigated to be used?
It's my understanding that the amendments that I've highlighted and read there are the officer's recommendations.
So I thought that originally, sorry, and I might be misunderstanding, but I read somewhere that originally the words in the first officer's report was just avoidance, and then Will asked for mitigated to be used. And my question is, do you know why it's been changed to minimised?
I mean, I could probably have a guess, if you'd like.
Please.
I would assume that, I mean, mitigated is more in line with avoidance, I would think. So where it's saying as a first priority to avoid, and then if avoidance is not practical, then move on to minimising those effects. If it was to mitigate, I would see that's almost akin to avoidance.
Okay. All right.
Is that helpful?
Not really, but anyway, I'll ask the officer when I get a chance.
Yeah.
And at your G, in that same paragraph, did you recommend deleting the word net?
No, that was also a recommendation from the officers.
Okay.
The reason why I included that policy there is that there were amendments that had come through from the Section 42A reports, but also the errata tables as well. So before I went on to discuss that policy, I just wanted to pull all those recommendations from the officers together just for clarification for my own purposes, I suppose, and to aid the discussion.
Okay, thank you. And I've just got one more, and it's in your evidence summary at paragraph 9, where you talk about waiting to hear from Ngārunanga and Turunanga or Ngaitahu about their views on what constitute a healthy water body. You'll be aware there's lots of information in numerous documents put out by Ngaitahu and Ngārunanga that give their views on what constitutes a healthy water body. So I'm not sure why you're waiting to hear about that in person from them, but I admit and I agree that it would be helpful to hear in person about what their views are, about the extent that PC7 gives effect to Te Mana o Te Wai.
Yes, and I was thinking there specifically in the context of Waimakariri. There's certainly information around, but I haven't seen much specifically in the context of Waimakariri since the MPSFM 2020 came out. I've looked at their evidence in chief, but again, that predated the NPSFM, so hence, you know, the interest where I presume they will be turning their mind to that.
Have I
when they present
misunderstood
to you.
your statement then, saying regarding, you know, what Ngāi Tahu views or constitutes a healthy water body? Is that in light of the NPS7 220? Is that what you mean?
That is what I mean, sorry.
I've misunderstood that. So thank you. I have no further questions.
Well, it's a pleasure to meet you, Ms. Sullivan.
Sorry,
Thank you for
Commissioner
your
Shepherd, I
evidence.
think Commissioner Van Voorshausen may have one more question if he can get his microphone to work.
Oh, right.
So,
Yes,
apologies.
Yes, sorry.
I can't see him, unfortunately.
No,
Yeah.
I'm aware of that. So.
Yeah, sorry, just one follow-up matter. Just in terms of that issue that Commissioner Solomon was raising with you regarding Policy 8419, I think the 10 July Consolidated Officer recommendations use the word mitigated, not minimised in that provision.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
That may be correct.
Just wanted to clarify that.
Okay, that I suspect.
There's been lots of changes.
Yes.
But not through. All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Well, thank you. It's been a very satisfying suite of witnesses, Mr. Williams, and not least with Ms. Sullivan's evidence. So we thank you for all of that. Thank you, Ms. Sullivan.
No, thank you, sir. And just to reiterate, there's two pieces of homework sitting on me. So one is looking at the king salmon exceptions, which we referred to, which I think does require some thought as against the NPSFM 2020. And the other one was providing Dr. Humphrey's work to Dr. Black and just making sure he's had a chance to look at that and comment if required. But thank you again for accommodating us. And
no trouble. It's an important, as I say, it's an important submission. And right, so an important industry, and we're not in any way wishing to cut short the presentation. We want it to be as full as it has been, and thank WRRP as well as Council and all the witnesses.
thank you.
Now, is Mr. Croft here?
Commissioner Shepherd.
The
Commissioner Shepherd, it's Tavisha. Mr. Croft vacated his slot and was replaced with Mr. Cragg, who was unable to stay for the afternoon.
Very well. So is the next submitter the Waimakariri District Council?
Yes, that's correct.
Splendid. Good afternoon. We understand there were to be two people speaking for the District Council. That was to be the Mayor, Mr. Gordon.
Correct.
And Kelly Simpson.
Correct.
And thank you both for coming in. And we would like you to present just as you feel comfortable with, and in whichever order you like. I suppose the Mayor normally goes first, is that right?
I'm happy to go first if that's right with Kelly.
Well, thank you, Mr. Gordon. Welcome. We're glad that you've come in, and we would like you to tell us what you've come to say.
Thank you, Commissioners, particularly to acknowledge you, as the Chair, David, as well as Commissioner Solomon and Commissioner Van Hoosten. My name is Dan Gordon and I'm the Mayor of the Waimakariri District. Prior to taking on that role in 2009, I was a District Councillor, first elected in 2004. As a councillor, I have represented rural and urban ward communities, but as with the role of Mayor, I have continued to seek the best overall interests of the district. I have, through this council-related work over many years as a long-term resident in rural and urban parts of Waimakariri, engaged widely across the district with those involved in farming and related aspects of rural life. I regard myself as very connected and aware of the needs, views and feelings in this sector. I have closely followed the work of the Waimakariri Water Zone Committee since its inception, and in particular the huge amount of work that committee undertook in preparing the Waimakariri Zone Implementation Programme Addendum, the ZIPA. I'm aware in broad terms of the extensive investigations and modelling of the potential future flows and concentration of nitrates in relation to both surface and groundwater quality, and the implications for this derive from differing past and present land uses and farm management practices as they affect nitrates runoff and infiltration.
Mr. Mayor, allow me to interrupt. You, I think, are reading the statement that you have kindly provided us.
Correct.
With. We have all read it to ourselves. You are very welcome to read it to us if you'd like to. Well, or if you'd prefer just to make some introductory comments, we do have it and we have all read it. And I've been following it and seeing that it is exactly the same.
That's fine. I would prefer to read it because the points and thank you for that opportunity, because the points I've made in here I've carefully considered, and I'd like to just make sure I read those to you carefully. So I would prefer to read it. Thank you.
We'll value that, and thank you for
that opportunity. I know that the consequential implications of differing nitrate concentration limit regimes into the future over time for land use, farm viability and impact on the rural sector has been significantly investigated and weighed in the Zone Committee's deliberations and recommendations proposed in the ZIPA. These balancing deliberations were the basis upon which the regulatory, as expressed in Plan Change 7 and the non-regulatory elements of the ZIPA, as recommended by the committee, came to the Council for its adoption. The ZIPA was adopted by the Waimakariri District Council in December 2018, and subsequently the Council's submission on PC7 expresses broad support for it, given its alignment with the ZIPA in September 2019. I was, and like almost all in our community that I've heard from, am still a supporter of both these instruments as signalling the need for change over time to deliver improved water quality outcomes. But as much as I'm concerned about that aim, I'm also concerned about the pace and nature of that change, being cognizant of its impact on community, and in this aspect I would like to focus my remarks on. When I spoke at the council meeting as a councillor in 2018 and moved the motion to adopt the ZIPA, I expressed gratitude for clauses being included that provided recognition of support for hardship and/or mental health, and the need to work together collaboratively. I did so because the chairperson of the Zone Committee in his report indicated that moving towards reducing nitrates to groundwater will have a significant economic impact on the district, and there was a risk that some dairy farmers will not be able to meet the targets set by changes to the Regional Land and Water Plan and will go out of business. I reflected on visiting a number of farms, demonstrating best practice and observing the industry leading the response, but noted it does come at a significant investment cost to farmers. As indicated earlier, I want to acknowledge the collaborative work of the Waimakariri Water Zone Committee and the excellent work that was achieved in the development of the zipper, demonstrated by 80 community meetings that involved farmers and the community. The discussions with the community were challenging but set achievable targets. Environment Canterbury have done an excellent job assisting the development of the plan. I'm not going to say that everyone was universally happy with what was developed in the end, and my basis of supporting this was because it was a process that collaborated with all parties, consulted widely, and reached a consensus that the majority could work with that meet the objective sought. It also had provisions to recognise hardship, as mentioned before. I supported the zipper process and the regulatory response to it, given the intensive analysis, diverse zone committee viewpoints, and wide-ranging community participation embodied in it, as reflected in the multiple varied objectives. I also note that the Zone Committee considered a range of possible nitrate plans from 1 milligram per litre to 6.9 milligrams per litre of nitrate for most rivers and streams, with lower limits in the Ashley, Rakahuru River and Waimakariri River. The effects of different limits on stream health and associated Ngāi values were considered. Economic and social impacts were also considered, particularly when the Zone Committee looked at how quickly limits could be achieved. As much as I know that responding to the MPS FM as gazetted in August 2020, subsequent to the final zipper and PC7 as notified, is a matter for the hearing panel to address. I suggest the matters referenced above from the zipper remain pertinent considerations for your deliberations on the pace at which PC7 should respond to this higher order document. WDC, when it adopted the zipper, supported the nitrate plan limits as a reflection of the various factors as above to be taken into account in setting an appropriate limit and time frame for that through a series of 15% farm plan cuts spread over the next 60 years. I am aware that the MPS FM 2020 has set a nitrate-nitrogen bottom line for rivers of 2.4 milligrams per litre, median value, to be achieved within a generation. Although this limit is not directly for groundwater, indeed there is no bottom line for groundwater, it is closely linked with spring water feeding a number of waterways in the Waimakariri district. I'm also aware of the viewpoint suggested the goal should be to limit any nitrates in the aquifer to below 1 milligram per litre, and that dairy farmers ought to be directed to achieve a 40% reduction within 10 years. A limit of 2.4 milligrams per litre median value within a generation, if applied to groundwater, would likely have much more significant community implications than even those contemplated by the Zone Committee and the committee that participated in the zipper process, let alone what might be termed the catastrophic consequences of that contemplated in paragraph 11 above. I do not have an expert view in relation to setting nitrate limits and timeframes for achievement and how the aspiration for reductions, which few would disagree with, should be finally resolved. But I am concerned about the integrity of the process if a significantly different outcome to that contemplated to date should be arrived at. More importantly, I, and I know many in the district community I represent, are deeply concerned at the prospective pace that change, and I urge the Commissioners to be fully cognisant in your deliberations of the potential extent and nature of community implications of any decision, especially on timing, made too literally in relation to the aspirations set through NPS-FM 2020. I do not believe achieving the NPS-FM 2020 nitrate limits within a generation is desirable, nor ultimately practical, as the economic and social costs could be too great. I'd also like to note that the NPS hasn't been through a select committee process, and there has been no consultation with affected parties. The work of the zipper that has led to PC7 is the process I respectfully ask you to carefully consider. From some farmers I meet, I'm worried that in adopting a stricter or quicker stance that the NPS foreshadows will lead to undue stress, and for some, their mental well-being is fragile. Further, if stricter standards are taken, this may lead to farmers revolting and ignoring. This is particularly pertinent now owing to the sharp economic downturn owing to COVID. Not to mention other government moves that appear to be threatening the agricultural sector. Ultimately, what we need is a regime that is achievable, that has broad industry buy-in, and there are reasonable timeframes set for change to happen. Most farmers I meet are in fact working to achieve change. There is no argument that we do need to improve water quality. The question is about being given time so that this can be reasonably achieved and not create undue hardship. Thank you for your time and listening to my points. And I'd now like to ask Mr. Simpson if he'd like to make some comments. Thank you.
Well, I wonder if we might see if there's some questions for you,
Sure.
Mayor, before we come to Mr. Simpson. Will you be agreeable to that?
Absolutely, sir.
Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions for Mayor Gordon?
No, no questions, thank you.
Commissioner Solomon, any questions?
Just one from me. You talk about having a relationship with the community. What's your relationship like with Te Ngāi
Our council has an excellent relationship with Ngāi I co-chair Mahitahi, which is a committee which means working together, and we work and meet regularly together on items of shared interest. So and I meet regularly down at the marae, and I like to think I have a very good relationship. But like all relationships, it's one you've got to keep working on and making sure that we keep connected with the issues that are important to all of us.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon. No more questions from me.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, may I ask you to come back to paragraph 14 of your statement? And in the last sentence there, you made a remark that I wanted to understand better. You understand that the NPS hasn't been through a select committee process and that there's been no consultation. Now, do you mean a select committee of the Parliament, of the House of Representatives? Is that what you mean?
That's correct.
But it's been through some other processes that weren't the select committee of the Parliament. Is that right?
Well, my understanding is it hasn't been through the select committee of the Parliament, so it hasn't had the tests that it would normally have been properly available to members of the public and to other parties. I understood that the desire of the government was to push through with reforms, and I certainly understand where they were coming from, but I think it's a fundamental part of our democracy that when you're driving such changes, that there is a proper due process for that. And as such, I don't think there's been adequate consultation with affected parties as a result. So I'm just making that comment there. Normally it would go through that process, but there was a speed in which these changes were being considered. And so that's the point I'm making.
I wonder if I'm misunderstanding, because normally a national policy statement, and there are half a dozen or so of them on different subjects, don't go through select committees because the RMA provides for them to be subordinate instruments, not acts of Parliament. And I had the idea that this particular NPSFM that's now dated 2020 started in 2019 with a public process and opportunities for people to lodge submissions and attend meetings up and down the country, and also various interest groups representing their collectives, such as the local government associations. Would that be the right word?
Yes. What I'm saying is I think a select committee process would have been a lot more thorough and rigorous. Indeed, when I first became mayor, I went to a number of local government forums, and this was the view that was being expressed by mayors through the rural and provincial sector. And our argument or our views to the ministers at the time, so Ministers O'Connor and Ministers Parker, was that they needed to slow this process down to enable proper consultation. Their view was they wished to get on with this and get this through as soon as possible. For a variety of reasons, they stated they had a mandate, was the words that they used. I remember very distinctly there. That was challenged quite significantly. So what I'm saying is this represents quite a significant change. Select committee process perhaps would have been a better way, or a model similar to that, for it to have been a bit more properly considered, would have been better. I don't think it's been, from the feedback I've had within the sector and through the forums I'm involved with in local government, albeit I've only been mayor for a year, it was certainly very strongly stated that this needed to be better tested with the public, those that are directly affected. And what I'm observing in here is that through the zipper process that the Waimakariri Water Zone Committee went through, which involved over 80 meetings, it was a very thorough process. So my point is that if you're considering what the NPS, the effect of the NPS, I'd like to respectfully ask you to carefully consider the zipper process and the PC that led to PC7, because in my personal opinion, from what was developed through that time, was a very thorough process that worked together with the industry and those who are directly affected and the community to seek change. If we want to seek the change, it's got to have the buy-in of that sector. And as I mentioned in my evidence as well, is that not everyone was universally happy through that process either, and I think both sides have one perspective and the other, and where it landed was about right in my personal opinion, because it had been through a thorough exercise.
Well, I'm glad I asked you, Mr. Mayor, because you've given me a better understanding of what it was that you were referring to in that paragraph of your thoughtful statement.
Thank you, sir.
We're grateful for that and for the clear presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner.
Now, Mr. Simpson, you have given us a statement of evidence, and we have, of course, read that in full. Do you wish to make any updates or corrections to that?
No updates or corrections, Commissioner Shepherd.
So is there anything then that you wish to add to that before we come to any questions we have of you?
Just a quick summary. So the 3 points that I'm highlighting in my brief of evidence, and also the additional information submitted, related to the three things being the consent durations, the changes to the nitrate limits, and also the efficient use of water policy. So within each of those, we're highlighting the impacts, some of them which we believe are unintended. Effectively drafting issues that are going to have additional consequences for us as an organisation. And also just to reiterate what Mayor Dan Gordon had mentioned regarding the potential impact of changes to the nitrate levels. So the zipper process was one that was well considered, and our organisation supported both the nitrate limits that were set for rivers as well as groundwater, and my role with it at the council is the Three Waters manager, so looking after the community water supplies as well. So making sure that both community water supplies as well as private water supplies were being accounted for in terms of the nitrate limits was a key consideration. And where the zipper landed we felt a good balance between drinking water standards requirements as well as what is environmentally, socially and economically affordable for the community. And we do acknowledge the requirements of the MPS for freshwater management 2020 and the requirement to give effect to the bottom line for rivers. But we believe that any changes to what has been proposed as part of the zipper process will actually require a robust assessment, both from a economic, environmental, as well as social impact. And there may actually be other alternatives than what's currently being considered in some of the evidence that could actually be considered. So, and it will have, it would have a big impact on our community, looking at the evidence provided through from the assessment, looking at what it would mean for our district to go down to a level of 1 milligram per litre of nitrogen would actually mean it would have a big impact, would have to revert to low intensity land use within our district, which would have a substantial impact. So they're the three main points I just wanted to highlight from my evidence.
Yes, well, thank you very much for that. Thank you for the full statement of evidence, which we all have in front of us as well. Any questions of Mr. Simpson, Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
Yes, just one matter referring to your 16th of November statement. And it's regarding policy 8422. And I'm just not clear what you're asking us to do. I've looked back at your original submission and the relief that you sought on that policy, and the 42A report has recommended more or less granting the relief that you sought. So what are you now asking us to do in relation to 8422?
So policy 8422 is a new policy under the efficient use of water relating specifically to Waimakariri District Council's stock water race system. And it effectively imposes something which we believe is unfair on us in terms of how we manage and operate our stock water race system. So we have a take at the moment.
I might just pause you there. I'm understanding all of that. So my question is that the relief you sought in your submission has been recommended to be granted more or less. So I don't know what further you're asking us to do with anything over and above what the officers have already recommended to us.
And I haven't refreshed my memory exactly what the change was in terms of the officers' report, but the relief we're actually seeking there is for that policy to be removed altogether.
Yeah, well, you didn't ask for that in your original submission, so then we might have some problem with that. But okay, thanks very much.
Commissioner Solomon, any questions, Mr. Simpson?
No questions from me, thank you.
Mr. Simpson, may I ask a question about your paragraph 11? The last sentence, you talk about analysis required to inform the panel on the proposed nitrogen limit for groundwater, if not already modelled, before a decision is made by the commissioners. Is that Schedule 1 of the Resource Management Act process? Or does the Schedule 1 process provide for consideration of amendments to plan changes that are requested in submissions and supported by evidence presented by submitters?
I have to be honest, I don't know the requirements of Schedule 1, but effectively what we're asking for there is if alternative limits for nitrogen are to be imposed as part of this process, then we would ask that a full assessment that considers an accurate assessment of the nitrates be undertaken. So the full assessment of from an economic and environmental perspective can be undertaken to ensure an informed decision can be made by the commissioners.
So is that essentially the process that we are following through in these 5 weeks of hearings?
I am aware of some of the additional work that has been requested and the memos that have been provided through to you as commissioners. I haven't been able to do a detailed assessment of them myself, but they indicate that there has been some modelling work undertaken to ascertain what the impacts might be. I do not know to what extent that has involved considering the environmental and economic impacts as well.
Thank you. I wonder if I can ask another question, please. And this relates to paragraph 18. And I'm not quite sure when you composed this, you might have composed it some little time ago. I've no doubt it's been an important piece of work for you to prepare this for us. But you refer there to consideration according to section 5.2c of the RMA. Now, I don't want to get you out of your area of competence. Not at all. And I'm certainly not wishing to do other than have a clear understanding of where you're at and what we can do about it. But we have had a bit of a change in the way the RMA has to be used in the last 5 or 6 years, with the intervention of the Supreme Court in a case called King Salmon. And whereas what you're asking for in terms of section 5.2c would once have been a very understandable thing for you to be asking for, and everybody would be saying yes, yes. The Supreme Court made a judgment to the effect that the decision makers shouldn't be doing that. They shouldn't be referring to Part 2 of the Act, which includes Section 5. They should be instead referring to the subsidiary instruments, such as the NPS FM 2020 that we've just been discussing. So I'm just not quite clear whether you're along with that or not.
No, I'm not familiar with that Supreme Court ruling, but the key point that I'm making here is that we currently operate a stock water race system. When we got the consent back in 1999, there were requirements in that consent to demonstrate efficient use of water. And we had to do audits to demonstrate we were using that water efficiently. This policy that is proposed now effectively tells us that we should not be efficient in our use of water because it's having an inconsequential benefit effect. And my simplistic way of looking at this is we're effectively being penalised because of somebody else's pollution in terms of how we operate and manage our stock water race system. So that's why I've said that this is unfair, and the reference to the Resource Management Act was purely to highlight the fact that Section 5.2c sets out the purpose is for people to actually avoid, remedy and mitigate adverse effects, where what we're actually, this policy is actually accepting that the upstream adverse effects are occurring and then imposing a requirement on a third party to offset that contamination. So that's our concern with policy 8.4.22.
Yes, so it's a down-to-earth question, a straightforward consideration, and doesn't require any high flights of philosophy like the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Mr. Simpson. That's been helpful, thank you, and I'm grateful to you for that. Now, you both of you helped us a lot with your contributions, and you have our grateful thanks. And unless there's anything further that you want to add by way of closing, we'll think of who the next submitter is.
Well, all I'd just like to say in closing is to thank you both, Mr. Chair, and the Commissioners for listening to our submission this afternoon and for giving it consideration, and we wish you well with your deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ashley Gorge Farming Company.
They're just stepping up now, Commissioner Shepherd.
Splendid, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming in. We have your submission and we welcome you to speak to it just as you would like. Introduce yourselves first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could I introduce my daughter, Sarah, who is director of our Ashley Gorge Farming Company and is supporting me here today. I think in Plan Change 5, I think I met you, sir, and Mr. Van Voorthuizen, and I've known Raymond Solomon from past involvements. Just to refresh the memory, I have been on your side of the table as Commissioner years ago from Environment Canterbury, sitting on the WRRP hearings from 2006 to 2010. I was appointed there when I was on the Regional Council. So I had a Regional Council life of 9 years from 1998 to 2007, and I was an NRRP Commissioner from 06 to 10. Then I retired. So in my retired capacity as an octogenarian, I'd make a few comments to to the plan that you have in front of you and that, as you said, you have read. So just speaking to it, and there are one or two matters which I'd like to draw attention to. Everyone has said that there's a great need to improve water quality. So far as I'm concerned, with our own 1,600 hectare, 4,000 acre plus property, I don't see anywhere, after 98 years of Johnston family ownership, I don't see anywhere on our property where we can improve water quality. We don't irrigate, we're dryland farmers, and our outflow goes to the Ashley. We're not contaminating the groundwater, and we're not contaminating the surface water that we are aware of. However, the rules being where they are, I have some serious concerns about some of them. The difference between Plan Change 5 and what we have in front of us with Plan Change 7 is terribly, terribly significant, hugely significant. And we submitted on Plan Change 5, and we were relatively happy. Well, we were happy with that 10% rule for winter forage, because being over 1,000 hectares, we were able to, without a consent, have 100 hectares of brassicas. Now, we've been growing 100 hectares of brassicas since I left school in the late 1950s. And we're still growing 100 hectares of brassicas. And it's all flats, and I don't see there's any environmental damage at all. Pardon me. And to reduce that down to 50 under these rules, I think is a nonsense. Particularly as I point out in top of page 3 about the maps. Now, these maps as they relate to our farm or our corner of the Waimak district on the south bank of the Ashley, where the Ashley comes out of the Gorge, we are in a most disadvantaged position vis-a-vis the lighter Lismore soils out on the banks of the Waimak, which were once in Earl State Forest, which are of alluvial origins, those gravels out there, by contrast with our soils, which are of glacial origins. The leaching ability, or the leaching factor on our flat soils is only a fraction of the leaching factor on the alluvial soils out near the Waimak. Now, as you know, that forest has now been turned into farms, and I think Naitahu have about 24 farms, dairy farms, on that land. So we're at the other end of the Waimak plains, sitting under the foothills on old glacial moraine flats, very, very hard to leach through. So that's one point. The other point I'd like to talk about is overseer. And 40 years ago, when I was on the wool board, we introduced sale by sample into the wool industry and objective measurement. And we had to objectively measure the key parameters of the wool fibre to satisfy the international, not only the international buying community, but the international wool processing community throughout globally, of the accuracy of those tests. And the three key ones were fibre diameter, yield, and vegetable content. And we got fibre diameter down to 0.1 of a micron. That's 0.1 of a millionth of a metre. The other two we got down to 0.1%. And more recently, they had fibre strength. My point is that, in my view, Overseer, as good a tool as it might be for comparative measurements, is so inaccurate with its acknowledged plus or minus 30% of accuracy. That's a wide range. That's a 60% range, plus or minus 30%. It should not be used for regulatory purposes. And it confounds me that it is still being promoted as the only decent mechanism they have, the only decent vehicle they have. I think Overseer should be banished from regulatory purposes. It has other attributes, but that's my view. In terms of consultation, I'll have to have a serious talk with Mayor Gordon. I know Dan very well, but he talked about the zone committees having 80 meetings. I think probably 77 of them might have been behind closed doors, because I only know of 3 public consultation meetings that the zone undertook in the preparation of this Plan Change 7. I went to one of them, and it was about 18 months before these serious changes took place. The zone committee themselves may well have known what they were doing. Obviously they did, but it caught most farmers by surprise, the significant changes that were imposed upon us, with the change to the maps that I've talked about, and the change in the winter kale or winter brassica thresholds, and they were halved by 50%. And the other serious thing, and there seems to be a differing opinion about this, and I can't get the right answer, and that is that one of the reasons that they made the changes was, or one of the reasons promoted, of the reasons for the changes, was that they believed that the Waimak surface water then became groundwater, and then it went under the Waimak and contaminated Christchurch's groundwater. Now, I've never been able to get a satisfactory answer about that subject. I've heard various arguments put forward that they put in some special bores and they measured the water on this side and that side, and the Christchurch side was contaminated. I just simply remind myself that in the old Capitone wool scour, they had there's a magnificent water supply there, which I think ECAN have consented for water bottling. Now, if they're so concerned about Waimak water going under the Waimak and contaminating Christchurch's groundwater, how on earth can they escape with the water bottling plant in Belfast? There needs to be a satisfactory answer to that, because the two seem to me to be quite incompatible. I think the key point of some of the narrative that you hear of lowering the nitrate standards down to 1 milligram, it would be absolutely disastrous. And Dan Gordon correctly drew attention to the mental health aspects of what's around the corner. The economic consequences are huge of the lowering of some of these standards, and there's an objective, I know, from some of what were then zone committee members and are now regional council members, of lowering cow numbers in Canterbury by 40%. Now, that is a politically driven agenda, and a lot of the zone is internal politics. And as a member of the Regional Council for those 9 years, I tried to keep politics out of my agenda. And I was a blue member who supported a red chairman, and I became his deputy, and proudly so. And I never, in all my regional council days, we had 6 rurals and 8 city members, and there was never ever a 6-8 division on urban-rural, and we had 6 so-called red members and 8 so-called blue members, and there was never an 8-6 split, blue-red. We had a very healthy environment. Fast forward a few years, the Zone Committee is a structure which I don't actually find terribly agreeably. I'm not terribly agreeable with it because it is appointed. And ECAN will appoint only those who they believe are pliable enough to go along with the flow. Anyone who's got a strong view or who is eloquent enough to express those views, they won't be appointed onto the Zone Committee. And a lot of the Zone Committee stuff is done behind closed doors. So I go down there many months, not every month, but many months, and I listen, and occasionally I have a 5-minute slot, something to say. It's usually about the Ashley River, where we've been waiting 27 years to get some action. But however, coming back to this, I think we've got to be very, very careful about the overlaying, or how the David Parker's freshwater standards may overlay the process that you are involved with and concerned about, because in some ways they overtake you, or do they not? I'm not sure. So there we are.
Well, thank you, Mr. Johnson. That's very helpful of giving us the benefit of your so many years of experience. May we see if there's any questions for you? Commissioner Van Voort, isn't any questions of Mr. Johnson?
No questions, thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
No, I have no questions, but I would like to say, setting aside at least 500 hectares to protect native bush and plant native corridors for the ecosystems that are reliant on it, I think is very admirable. So thank you.
Well, thank you for that. I started my environmental focus a long time ago. In fact, before the Department of Conservation was even formed, I was busy putting in covenants numbers 21 and 21A of a tussock hill block and a native bush area. And that was about 700 acres in total. And then in 2014 or something, we put another 600 into a Waimakariri District Council Indigenous protection area. So there's a large area of my hill country is protected one way and another. And I'm very proud of that.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Now, you've given us a full-page typed up submission, and that's got all the detail of what you're asking for, and we thank you for that. And I'm wondering if your daughter, Ms. Johnson, is going to add anything to what's been said by her father.
I think he's probably said enough.
You don't wish to add anything more?
No. I think we've said enough on behalf of the family. Thank you.
Yes, well, please understand that we're grateful that you've come in and given us that clear analysis of the situation.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Now, next we have Eader and Morris. Gentlemen, you've given us a submission. How would you like to present it to us today?
Good afternoon. Yes, we have quite an extensive further submission to make in relation to our somewhat brief submission that we originally submitted, and particularly over Rule 8.7.1. Just by way of introduction, I'm Michael Eader, and beside me here is Greg Morris, and you will no doubt have read in the introduction to our submission the background to our farming operations.
Yes, we've got that here.
Okay, so with no further ado, I'll get into it. Is that all right?
Yes, yes,
okay.
By all means, thank you.
Saltwater Creek is a small meandering spring-fed system that discharges into the Ashley River estuary. It is noteworthy for both extensive areas of salt marsh vegetation and the extent to which tidal effects and saltwater intrusions at high tide dominate flows in the lower reaches, hence its name. The riparian margins of the creek are bordered by rushes and introduced grasses tolerant to episodes of flooding with saline and brackish water. Salt water will kill willows, so we do not see willows start to appear until 200 metres below our irrigation take point. So from where the willows start, Saltwater Creek can be considered to be fresh water on the surface at least. However, depending on the discharge and the stage in the tidal cycle, saline intrusions may penetrate further upstream, flowing beneath the less dense surface freshwater layer. It is above the upstream end of these intrusions where our surface takes are sited. Tidal effects can still be measured at Factory Road, where there are spring tides. So water takes can be considered. So our water takes can be considered to lie within the tidal freshwater zone of the estuary. We were first granted consent to take water from Saltwater Creek in the early 1980s. As I described above, our takes are sited in the tidal freshwater zone, and at our site, the incoming tide holds up the fresh water that results in significant upstream flows. The advent of irrigation on our farms has enabled our families to continue to farm and make a living from the land. We have a close and dependent relationship to the Saltwater Creek that runs through our properties. At times, the creek and its tributaries can be our biggest curse, and floodwaters can inundate up to 90% of our farms, being the main conduit for floodwaters from a large catchment area extending up to the Ashley Downs and including the land where the Ashley Forest is now. We, along with the wider community, have appreciated the amenity values that the creek provides for recreational boating, trout and whitebait fishing. We provide unfettered access for fishermen to cross our paddocks, to access the creek directly from the road, bypassing the need for them to access the creek by walking along the long way up or down the Queen's Chain. We took the initiative in the 1980s to fence off the banks of the creek to provide habitat that, one, allows plant species that are more tolerant of the saline habitats to be competitive, helping to stabilise the creek banks. 2, it helps to eliminate stock, or does eliminate stock entering the creek, eliminating downstream pollution. 3, that riparian areas we've fenced off reduces sediment runoff. And finally, and probably not least importantly, assists the whitebait spawning on the spring tides by providing cover for the inanga eggs that spend 3 or more weeks developing on the creek banks before being picked up by the next spring tide and taken out to sea. Incidentally, several freshwater biologists who have studied the creek have commented to me that any lack of suitable spawning vegetation is unlikely to limit spawning production, and studies indicate that heavy fishing pressure is more likely to have a significant impact on the population size in the creek. In recent times, we've been working with ECAN on further riparian planting, including an immediate steps funding project. We're taking seeds from a number of native specialised plants that have adapted to the tidal zone and the more challenging saline habitats further downstream to provide for more successful establishment and effectiveness of the riparian margins. We're founding members of the Saltwater Creek Catchment Group, which will engage a far wider spectrum of people in the community other than just the economic scale farmers farming along its margins. Our aim with this group is to limit transfer of nutrients and sediment at source on individuals' properties, rather than the responsibility and blame being placed on those adjoining the creek for environmental outcomes. In the very dry summer of 1998, our 2 water surface takes from Saltwater Creek were rendered unusable because the Toppings Road measurement point had fallen to 44 litres a second. At the time, the minimum flow required was 100 litres a second. It meant that we had to stop irrigating completely, and yet further downstream of Toppings Road, but above our take, the flow at the Factory Road Bridge was 222 litres a second, an extra 178 litres. We were able to show that the flow closer to our take has more relevance for setting the minimum flow and for monitoring our consents. Given our maximum combined take of 44 litres a second and the 100 litre minimum flow downstream of our take, we gained approval for the minimum flow of 150 litres at Factory Road before we had to cease our take. There is a significant additional influx of water from springs that enter the creek between the gauging point at Toppings Road and our take site. There have been 4 gaugings carried out concurrently at the 2 sites by ECAN since, and the differences in flow were consistently higher downstream at Factory Road, with the difference ranging from 46 litres to 244 litres a second more. There are also additional springs entering the creek between Factory Road and our intake, resulting in more water being measured below our takes, even with our pumps operating, than the concurrent reading at Factory Road. I now refer to Section 42, the Section 42A report, point number 6.9, and I quote, "We note that Toppings Road is approximately 1,500 metres upstream of Factory Road. Springs are located throughout the area, and so flow generally increases in a downstream direction as further springs add flow to the river. Data available for these sites is very limited, but does show an increase in flow between the 2 sites. No work has been undertaken to assess what a comparable minimum flow at Factory Road would be, but this would require a multi-year data collection program to determine." Well, we've made a start to collating more data and have analysed the past gauging records from the last 40 years. We commissioned Boreman consultants to undertake flow measurements through the last summer at the 3 sites, so Toppings Road, Factory Road and downstream of our takes. Unfortunately, the 3rd of the gauging events, scheduled for April, could not take place due to the COVID lockdown. The 2 gaugings that were done in January and March this year showed an additional 55 litres entering the creek between Factory Road and downstream of our takes. We have a consent condition that requires a minimum flow of greater than 100 litres below our takes. However, the tidal nature of the creek means that this realistically only applies for a few hours around low tide. Creek flows are reversed on the incoming tide and always much greater than 100 litres a second for most of the outgoing tide. We submit that we have a fairly unique set of circumstances that require a little more thought and accommodation than the blanket approach to the whole allocation zone that ECAN is proposing. And we have suggested what we believe to be a workable solution. We plan to measure flows again this summer to reinforce the data already collected. We recognise there are benefits to the wider community and that we should all share in the pain of improving the minimum flows in the creek. We note the economic assessments written for the plan change. Those were reports published in March 18 and July 19, and I quote, "The increase to a minimum flow from 100 litres to 148 litres per second regime has a very low reliability, with below 40% of the water available on average. Irrigation is unlikely to be a viable proposition under these levels of reliability. When costs associated with debt, depreciation and management are taken into account, the irrigators from this resource would experience substantial losses." End of quote. On a more personal level, in addition to the significant money we are spending on riparian planting, we were planning to invest heavily in converting our irrigation system from less water efficient high pressure guns to centre pivots and small sprinklers. The reality is that we do not envisage being confident enough to make this long-term investment without the certainty that water constraints will not significantly limit production and cause financial hardship. Providing Factory Road can be incorporated into the Saltwater Creek line of Table 8.1 with an increase in the minimum flow from 150 litres to our suggestion of 200 litres per second, and without further changes to minimum flows, we would have the confidence to invest in infrastructure that is designed for a 40-year lifespan and would require payback over that period. On allocation limits, we do agree, however, that given current use of allocation is about 67%, there is room to bring the allocation limit down to the proposed 75% over time. And we support the figure of 417 litres a second in Table 8.1. We note in the Section 42A report that the ECAN officers have recommended rejecting our submission. I quote point 691 from their report. "The Toppings Road is a good place to collect robust gaugings, whereas the Factory Road site is far more challenging. Hence, there are issues with making this the minimum flow site for the whole of the Saltwater Creek allocation zone. In addition, Saltwater Creek is a particularly challenging zone to manage. It includes a large number of subcatchments and the abstractions are distributed widely. We note that whilst there may be some technical merit in moving the minimum flow site relating to the submitter's water takes, this needs to be balanced with the requirement to manage all takes in the Saltwater Creek allocation zone. In this regard, we consider that the Toppings Road site is the better management site, and as such, we recommend rejecting the relief sought by the submitters." So our response to that is, firstly, while we acknowledge the Toppings Road site is slightly easier to gauge, gaugings have been conducted at Factory Road over the years, 4 by ECAN, and last summer, 2 commissioned by us by Boreman Consultants. So it is demonstrated that it can be done. It would seem, as far as ECAN is concerned, convenience overrules accuracy and fairness of measurement of actual water present in the creek. in the past, Toppings Road has been used as the first trigger point in determining the flow in Saltwater Creek. Once the minimum flow is detected there, measurements have been conducted at Factory Road to ensure our consents are complying. There has never been a flow recorded at Factory Road that is below the Toppings Road minimum flow of 100 litres a second plus 50%, that is 150 litres a second. We're not asking for the gauging site to be changed to Factory Road for the whole of the allocation zone, but that it is included in the table in addition to the Toppings Road value for the consent holders taking surface water and connected groundwater from those sites downstream of Factory Road. And that we suggest Factory Road has a higher minimum flow in line with the cultural and ecological minimum flows that Fish and Game and Ngāi Tuariri Rananga have submitted on, and as recommended by the Waimakariri Zone Committee. We wish to emphasise once again that your decision on this particular matter will impact greatly on our future viability, and hopefully we have demonstrated that the additional gauging point is workable and enhances the minimum flows for the wider community's benefit. We would encourage a far more collaborative approach from ECAN when it comes to fact gathering on aspects of the creek. Many reports have been prepared on the creek, many for this plan change, and not one of these people preparing the reports have sought out any information from us farming along and very familiar with the creek. Finally, we would welcome any further discussions with the commissioners and or ECAN officers to ensure our suggestions are incorporated and are workable and compliant with any legalities of the plan. I do have another short piece, but that covers that point, so I think that's an appropriate place to stop.
Well, you've gone to a lot of trouble to prepare all of that in full detail for us, and we're very grateful to you for that. Let's see if there's any questions. Commissioner Van Veldhuizen?
How many consent holders, how many abstraction consents below Factory Road are there?
Right.
There's 3.
Okay. Now, we've had other submitters raise issues with Saltwater Creek, and I think I've asked the ECAN officers, who they do an end of hearing report to us, to come back and further address the issue of Toppings Road versus Factory Road in light of the evidence presented to us. And if I haven't already asked that, then just I'm asking it now, but I think I have already, so we'll certainly be giving some good thought to the issues that you raised.
That's appreciated.
Thank you.
We do have this report from Bormans as well that we haven't, got to you.
That's right. I noticed you were reading out a lot of type material. It'd be really good if you can make a copy of that available to our hearings.
That'll be fine. We'll make sure we get it sent through.
Yeah, that'll be great. Thank you.
Commissioner Solomon, any questions?
No, none from me, thank you.
Well, as I say, we're very grateful to you both for the trouble you've taken to come and present this clearly for us. This is exactly what we're here for, so thank you indeed, and thank you for coming in.
Thank you. So we just have, I've just got one very short comment to make on another of our submissions relating to opposing Rule 8517.1 regarding the transfer of consents.
Oh yes, you?
Yep.
That's another popular topic.
Yes, well, we notice in the Section 42A report that the officers comment that no specific reasoning was provided in our submission to delete this rule in its entirety, and so I thought we'd better just clarify that we are concerned that if a property changes hands, that the consent transferred is subject to these provisions, that obviously going forward the viability and productivity of that land is going to be severely impacted in the course of a change of ownership.
We understand.
Thank you.
We've heard something similar. You'll be surprised to hear. Thank you indeed.
Thank you.
Now, there's a submission by On-Farm Data. Is someone going to speak for them?
Commissioner Shepherd, they're not here.
They're not here?
No.
What about Melbury Limited?
Yes, they're here. They're just coming up now.
Thank you.
Now, I have a presentation of my key points.
Thank you. So you're Mr. Metherall, are you?
Yes, Dr. Metherall. So I have a variety of points in my evidence and a variety of points of view of background as to why I'm here. I do want to iterate that I'm here in a personal capacity. I work for Ravensdown and prior to that for Ag Research, and a lot of my evidence draws on the experience that I have in my professional career of 40 years as an agricultural scientist with particular emphasis on nutrient modelling.
All right, so I'm making a particular note that you want to notice that you're submitting in your personal capacity.
Yes, yes.
Thank you, got a note of that.
So the key points that I wish to cover are the use of so-called good management practice in loss rates in Plan Change 7, and the use of those same good management practice in loss rates in the modelling leading to the policies in which Plan Change 7 aims to implement. I'd like to address the impact of uncertainty in modelling in the policy development. I'd like to address the changes to the winter grazing thresholds, as Mr. Johnson also referred to, and changes relating to eliminating policy related to the orange nutrient allocation zone for the Ashley River catchment. And I'd like to particularly comment that the focus of a lot of evidence for most submitters has been on the nitrate priority area, which has resulted in less consideration of other aspects of the plan change, just probably particularly from the industry bodies that I have some association with. I'd like to highlight there's a lack of evidence for nitrate effects on Formidium cyanobacteria, which is a problem in the Ashley River. And I'd like to introduce some evidence related to the significance of nitrate in the groundwater that wasn't in my original submission or evidence, but has been raised by other submitters or other people presenting evidence. So the good management practice loss rates, these were introduced in Plan Change 5, based on modelling proxies for use in overseer for good management practices for nitrogen, fertiliser, irrigation and other farm management practices. So initially there was a set of guidelines booklet produced which had widespread industry agreement, but then through the process leading up to Plan Change 5, there was an attempt to introduce proxies for the amount of nitrogen that was appropriate to be applied under good management practice and appropriate levels of irrigation. And those models became the basis for the proxies and the farm portal results for estimated nitrate leaching from farms. And despite arguments raised during the Plan Change 5 process, those proxies were carried through into the adopted Plan Change 5. But subsequent to that, with further concerns raised, ECAN set up an implementation working group and a technical working group to specifically look at the issues that were being raised by industry about those calculations for nitrogen and irrigation that were being included in the farm portal results and in the work underlying Plan Change 7. As a result of recommendations from that group, and I was part of the technical working group asked to participate by ECAN, those proxies were declared erroneous by the council, and in my evidence there's a letter from the chair of the council basically stating that. At the end of that process, the implementation working group made a recommendation to council. It would not be responsible to notify Plan Change 7, given the technical working group's advice has significant implication for catchment models used to assess effects and determine appropriate reduction regimes. Well, despite those recommendations, very soon after that, Plan Change 7 was released, which did not remove the erroneous good management practice proxies used in the modelling. That was a major disappointment from someone that had put a lot of time and effort into pointing out where the problems were and looking for potential solutions to the problems. There was also extensive use of those proxies made in the catchment scale modelling leading to Plan Change 7, which adds uncertainty to the results of that modelling. So the use of those proxies has compromised a substantial part of the basis of the plan change, especially in relation to the proposed nitrogen reduction targets in the nitrogen priority area of the Waimakariri zone. And as I've mentioned, increasing uncertainty. So it's further concern that the proposed reductions in N leaching for individual farms are from a good management practice baseline which incorporates the erroneous proxies. So we've sort of got, you know, an errors building on errors here with the use of that, those proxies. So it is my submission that all references to good management practice loss rates be removed from the plan and be replaced by the baseline loss rates, or that Plan Change 7 adds a clause to specifically remove the Schedule 28 fertiliser proxies and modifies the irrigation proxy in line with the technical working group recommendations. I now want to move on to address the aspect of uncertainty in the modelling. I was invited by ECAN to become part of an expert panel to assess the uncertainty and potential bias in the nitrogen load estimates calculated by Overseer for the catchment scale modelling of nitrogen loss to water. That work was reported in summary in a paper Irrigation 2018 presented at the Fertiliser and Lime Research Centre workshop at Massey University, which is available in the documents in relation to the plan change. This figure comes out of that paper and highlights the aspects that we considered in that process, and I want to specifically address some of those. So under the model uncertainty, there's a number of different components that we divided the subject up into to try and assess what the uncertainty of the different components was. There were also different land class uses that were considered and different soil groups within the Waimakariri zone taken into consideration in order to come up with an overall assessment of the uncertainty and bias that might be present in the overseer results leading into the catchment scale modelling. There was a further assessment of uncertainty of some aspects of the catchment model, groundwater model as well. Structural error I'll discuss in the next slide, relating particularly to the overseer model. Land use mapping area error, this is whether land is dairy farms or sheep and beef farms or lifestyle blocks or irrigated or non-irrigated. That was considered to be relatively small but definitely not perfect. There's how the various land uses were represented in terms of representative farms, a process that had been largely part of the matrix of good management process to come up with typical farm systems, and environmental data error. This is errors in the information that we have on climate and soils, and I particularly want to highlight an issue with the soils which has actually become apparent just in the last few months. A very crucial parameter in overseer modelling is the characteristic of plant available water, the amount of water that soil profile holds before any drainage occurs. Over the last year or so, Landcare Research have reassessed the basis for those estimates in the SMAP database because the original data set was across all of New Zealand was very limited, and that was extrapolated to soils across the rest of New Zealand. They were able to bring more information into that database and reassess those plant available water characteristics. And the changes introduced in beginning of September of this year have had an impact on the Waimakariri zone. So most of what we would call the lighter soils, the more stony soils in the sort of more western part of the catchment, have actually had an increase in their plant available water values, which would result in less nitrate leaching, and the heavy soils, which tend to have higher plant available water values, they have had a decrease in plant available water. So that adds another level of doubt about the accuracy of the modelling. And then that last element of model uncertainty is the translation between what was defined as good management practice and current management practice, and I've got a slide referring to that. So now addressing specifically the element of structural error and overseer. So there is considerable uncertainty associated with the ability of overseer to model predicted nitrate leaching losses for different land use classes on each group of soils and each particular climate situation. The Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment reviewed overseer and produced a report in 2018 and highlighted many issues relating to uncertainty and the lack of documentation and transparency in key aspects of the model. It's, in my view, quite damning that the key model that's a lot of reliance is placed on an overseer. The nitrogen model has never been published in full and is not available for review. Similarly, the phosphorus loss model has the documentation that is available, isn't complete, and has errors identified in it. And as a member of the fertiliser industry, even though we have an ownership involvement in overseer, we do not have the ability to, or when we have asked for the information, it's not provided to us. And suggestions that we have made for improvements haven't been implemented. There's data to validate overseer at a farm scale is sparse across New Zealand. Most of that validation data comes from dairy farms, and there is very limited validation data for light soil groups. Essentially, there is one data point on part of Lincoln University dairy farm that the validation relies on to represent most of the dairy farms in the Waimakariri zone. So that was a key factor taken into account in that uncertainty analysis that I was involved with. Also, the fact that there is no validation data of any substance for sheep and beef farms, or at the time for cropping farms. There's been a little bit more information become available recently, but it hasn't really been used in a proper validation exercise yet. There are problems with the modelling approach with overseer, and particularly that it uses a fixed synthetic climate regime, sort of based on long-term average annual values of rainfall, with the pattern in each year determined by regional parameters, which essentially gives you a sort of a daily rainfall regime that's very fixed. For example, it might be that overseer will say there's going to be a rainfall on the 10th of April, and the size of that's determined sort of in relation to the annual rainfall. Well, we all know that rainfall is a lot more variable than that, and it's the actual rainfall that is really going to impact on leaching on actual farms. And so the use of long-term climate information, particularly in relation to baseline year modelling, is quite problematic, and especially when you determine what the irrigation regime should be in relation to that overseer climate. There's been quite a recent discussion that Overseer Limited has implemented in terms of how irrigation should be modelled in overseer in relation to actual year ends. But really, in my view, they should be addressing the real problem is the fact that it's using this fixed climate regime model. There's a number of known bugs and weaknesses in the model, particularly in relation to non-pastoral management and land uses. The cropping model has a number of significant issues in it, particularly in relation to the estimation of nitrogen mineralisation and immobilisation in the soil. If you take land use, which is prevalent in the Waimakariri district of lifestyle blocks, there's basically no information as to what's likely to be happening there, and what nitrate impact is, losses from like the septic tanks are. That's just a big level of uncertainty that is relatively significant in terms of land area and number of septic tanks in Waimakariri zone. Overseer uses a number of default values from sort of national databases, and there's one particularly in relation to pasture quality that's really problematic for Canterbury dairy farms, in that it uses pasture quality levels from databases maybe 20 years old, which aren't appropriate for the way that dairy farms on irrigated land in Canterbury are managed with maintaining high pasture quality. The implication of that is that because pasture quality is estimated as low, the animal requirement model is based on a metabolizable energy requirement. The amount pasture intake estimated by overseer is too high. Therefore, the nitrogen intake by the animals is too high. Therefore, the nitrogen excretion by the animals is too high. Therefore, leaching is too high. So that's just was one of the aspects of structural error that was, to some extent, as best we could, taken into account in that uncertainty and bias exercise that I participated in. And the last aspect of that was the translation from a so-called good management practice to a current management practice. So the base overseer modelling scenarios used in the catchment scale modelling assumed good management practice, but then there was a requirement to estimate, well, what would be happening under current management practice. And so they sort of had to use a back translation of what the impact of the modelling proxies was on error and bias in the nitrogen leaching. So that was really an unnecessary extra step that added more uncertainty to it. So generally, the erroneous good management practice modelling proxies greatly increased the uncertainty in the N-loss estimates. Want to just move, though it's not my area of expertise, just move on to some observations about the groundwater modelling, and that did not consider attenuation of nitrate by denitrification, which is well recognised to be an important practice, not an important practice, an important attribute of aquifers throughout New Zealand. So whilst the attenuation is considered to be relatively low for most of the Waimakariri catchment, it should have at least still been included in the model, because in the eastern part of the Waimakariri zone, attenuation would definitely be happening, and that should have had a similar uncertainty estimate to the above ground impact. So I considered that was a deficiency in the way that catchment model was implemented. So despite all of those levels of uncertainty, the modelling showed that there was likely to be only a small increase in the median equilibrium nitrate concentrations in comparison to the current measured nitrate concentrations. But it also showed there was a very high level of uncertainty in the projected equilibrium nitrate concentrations. So the 95% confidence interval spanned a range from very low up to about 9 milligrams per litre. But even at that highest level of uncertainty, that was still below the drinking water limit of 11.3 milligrams per litre. And furthermore, the median levels were less than half of the drinking water standard. So based on that, the issue, well, maybe need to be recognised, wasn't something that necessarily meant that we had to put in place immediate and urgent changes. And so my recommendation is that given the very high level of uncertainty in the projected values, it's not appropriate to set in place policies which are increasingly restrictive on land management without having an adaptive management framework based on ongoing research and monitoring of nitrate levels in the groundwater. I now want to move on to a point which wasn't in my original evidence but was brought up by other submitters, one of whom referenced my evidence in his rebuttal and other evidence that I became aware of when I was watching the, some of the early presentations to this hearing. And this is a paper that's been widely quoted as the Danish nitrate study and raising concerns about the impact of nitrate in drinking water and the risk of colorectal cancer. And this paper was quoted in the evidence of Dr. Chambers, Dr. Rankin and others. However, if you actually go and look at the data that was presented in association with that paper in supplementary material, the results in that supplementary material do not support the conclusions in the paper. This is, on the left-hand side, the complete data from the supplementary material, and you'll see that there's columns for incidence rate for colon cancer and rectum cancer against 5 levels of nitrate exposure from that study, and I've graphed those on the right-hand side, and you'll see that at very low levels of nitrate, there is a level of colon cancer and rectal cancer that is higher than if you move to intermediate levels of nitrate exposure. And then if you moved up to the highest level, it's back to being very similar to what the very lowest level of was. So essentially, there is no difference in colorectal cancer incidence between the lowest level of nitrate exposure and the highest. So my plea to the commissioners is to disregard any evidence in relation to that study. It's been further pointed out in an article published in New Zealand Doctor that the validity of the Danish study has been dismissed by Professor Frank Frizzell, Medical Advisor for Bowel Cancer New Zealand, and Dr. Deborah Woodley, Ministry of Health Deputy Director General, Population Health and Prevention. So it's just not my view on that data, it's also our New Zealand medical experts. And now I'd like to move on to the topic of the winter grazing threshold, which was also raised by Mr. Johnson. So Plan Change 5 adopted a threshold of 10% of the farm area for farms between 100 and 1,000 hectares as being at a level which typical farm management practices would remain as permitted activities. This is for the percent of the farm in winter crops grazed by cattle. However, within months of Plan Change 5 being made operative on 1st of February 2019, Plan Change 7 seek to introduce a change to that rule for the Waimakariri zone, reducing a percentage of the farm for winter grazing down to 5%. Firstly, this was not justified based on any of the reasons presented, or not, in fact, not really presented in the zipper, and it makes a mockery of the planning process. So my submission is that the Plan Change 5 winter grazing thresholds should be maintained with no change to those being necessary under Plan Change 7. I also would like to submit that the definition of winter grazing should take into account how winter grazing is actually managed, as there is no differentiation between 24/7, effectively having animals on winter crops continuously, and what would be considered a good management practice of restricted grazing in conjunction with pastoral blocks, where animals are only on the winter crop for 2 or 3 hours per day and then back onto pasture. And that will have a markedly different impact on nutrient loss. I'd now like to move on to changes in Plan Change 7, which effectively eliminated the previous definition of the orange nutrient allocation zone, and actually neglected to say in my introduction that Melbury Limited was the farm that was owned by my family for over 100 years in the North Lowburn area on the banks of the Akuku River, which was in the orange zone, although that the farm has just recently been sold. However, Plan Change 7 did have a major impact on both our plans for the farm in the middle of last year and the Lowburn Irrigation Company. The Lowburn Irrigation Company runs a small irrigation scheme taking water from the Akuku River on the edge of our property, and for many years they have had a desire to put in some storage to increase the reliability of irrigation, because in midsummer, in January typically, the water levels in the Ashley River drop below a threshold and they have to stop irrigation because they have no storage. So putting in storage was a really good idea for them, and they had been talking to Melbury Limited for probably the last 20 years about could we have some land to put some storage in. So over the last few years, they had come up with an economic case where they could build some storage, and we had said that we would provide land for that on the basis that we could have water for irrigating a small part of our farm. It was only going to be something like 30 hectares that will be sufficient water to water. But that would have given increased reliability to growing crops on our farm and the reliability that the irrigation company wished to have. However, in between sort of initially signing that agreement and implementing it, Plan Change 7 came out, and because the rules originally pertaining to the orange nutrient allocation zone had disappeared basically, the threshold for permitted increase in irrigation area decreased from 50 hectares to 10 hectares. That meant that we wouldn't be able to put in irrigation, more than 10 hectares of irrigation without having consent. There was no guarantee that we would get a consent for that, and so we decided that we couldn't go ahead with that plan and removed the option for Lowburn Irrigation Company to take or use land on our property for their water storage. So it really put in jeopardy the community scheme as well as removed an opportunity for our farm. Subsequently to that, the irrigation company did purchase some land for us, from us, but it cost them a rather large amount of money for the amount of land that they purchased. So that was still a major cost to the community. So there was no justification for that change presented in the zipper. I attended some of the zone committee public meetings, I think probably a couple of them, and anything, reasons that were presented for that seemed entirely spurious, related to likelihood of fodder crops being grown on lifestyle blocks, which was just ridiculous. So there was no substantial reason. Oh, that was with the winter grazing threshold, and there was nothing presented in terms of for the change to the orange zone rules. In some of the documents available to the hearing commissioners is one Krilliger and Etheridge 2019, and that states modelling results for the Ashley River Rakahuri catchment suggest that nitrate concentrations are unlikely to change significantly under good management practice, plan change 5 permitted activities and current pathway scenarios for most watercourses. So there was no threat to nitrate levels in the Ashley River under any of those scenarios. The most significant environmental issue in the Ashley River Rakahuri is the toxic cyanobacterium formidium, which is, can be quite an issue, causes the toxic algal blooms, so it restricts swimming and is toxic to dogs particularly. However, reducing the nutrient levels in the river, which is presumably the reason for putting restrictions, further restrictions on the Ashley catchment, will not improve the situation with formidium. Research by Tara McAllister shows that formidium levels are greatest at low nutrient levels. So policies to manage nutrients in the Ashley Rakahuri Freshwater Management Unit are very unlikely to result in any reduction in toxic cyanobacterial blooms. So on to, just to conclude, firstly, environmental policy should primarily be based on robust monitoring data rather than highly uncertain modelling. The modelling can assist with policy development and implementation, but it must not use erroneous functions, particularly in this instance, the GMP fertiliser and irrigation proxies. Any future requirements for changes in farm practice should be based on an adaptive management framework based on ongoing research and monitoring. And zone-based changes to regional and national rules should only be made when there is a very clear requirement based on robust local data. The purported colorectal health risk from groundwater nitrate claimed by some submitters is not supported by the actual data from the Danish study that those submitters quote, or by New Zealand medical professionals. I guess a suggestion as an alternative means, I haven't really included this in previous evidence, localised risks in shallow groundwater drinking water supplies that may occur in parts of the Waimakariri zone could be managed with a lower economic cost by implementation of a reticulated water supply, and I haven't seen that suggested in the plans anywhere. And last point is that, to reiterate, that the main ecological problem in the Ashley River, toxicity from cyanobacteria formidium, is not driven by elevated nutrient levels and will not be resolved by planning changes that aim to reduce the nutrient levels in the river. So thank you very much for giving me the time to present that and for reading my evidence.
Well, Dr. Metherall, you have put a great deal into this, and it's a very comprehensive presentation on several important points. So we're grateful to you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions of Dr. Metherell?
Yeah, just three. In your verbal presentation, you mentioned you had made available to us a letter from, I think, the CEO of Environment Canterbury declaring the portal proxies erroneous. I couldn't find that letter attached to your evidence anywhere.
That is quoted in point 3.2.
No, but
I haven't actually made, I guess I haven't made the full letter available. I guess I would can make that that available. I mean, I guess I was privileged to see and have a copy of it, but through my role at Ravensdown, so I guess I can provide that, or council officers could source that for you.
well, I prefer you to, since
Okay.
you've referred to it,
Sure.
and
Yep.
just so we can see what,
Provide.
exactly what it says.
We'll do that.
And then you mentioned that the SMAP plant available water values had changed recently that overseer uses. And you mentioned September. I didn't catch what year that was.
Oh, that was this year.
September
Yeah,
2020.
very recently. It's like
Yep.
September the 1st this year, there was new data introduced.
Okay, thank you. And I found in terms of your PowerPoint, the slides on the Danish study were interesting. Slide number 12, when you refer to the New Zealand doctor article, when I clicked on the link, it just told me I needed a log on, so I couldn't take it any
yes, yeah,
further. So can you provide the actual paper to us?
Unfortunately, I probably can't under copyright, because the copy that I have was under a copyright restriction through Ravensdown's agreement with the organisation that sources that material. I wonder if perhaps the council may be able to request it, or else I could email the author and see if I can get a copy of it.
Yeah, anything you can do in that regard would be helpful, because the point you make on slide 12, I mean, if it's correct, it's a powerful point. If that study has been dismissed by those people you referred to, I'd certainly like to see the basis of that.
I'll endeavour to get permission to provide that to you.
Yeah, thank you. And other than that, no further questions, thanks.
Commissioner Solomon?
Yes, I just have one, and it is about your letter the letter from the council. You say in your evidence, or you state the letter in your evidence, council agrees with the working group that nitrogen fertiliser proxies can contribute to nitrogen loss rate figures that are erroneous. Now, I may be being overly picky, but I wonder why the words can contribute were used rather than just contribute. Because using the words can contribute implies that sometimes the proxies may not be erroneous.
Well, an example where the proxy would be erroneous is wouldn't be erroneous as dryland farming with no nitrogen fertiliser, because they would not apply.
Okay.
I would say actually the impact of the nitrogen fertiliser proxy might actually be greatest on dryland farms, because the way those proxies work is that effectively if pasture production is less than 10,000 kilograms of dry matter, or some such number, because again documentation wasn't entirely clear, but about that level, then the proxy says nitrogen fertiliser should not be used under good management practice, which is quite clearly incorrect, in that some nitrogen fertiliser can be used in a dryland environment with a benefit for the farm and little environmental impact.
Which is probably why we need to source the letter.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay.
No more questions from me, thanks.
Well, Dr. Metherell, not only have you, as I was saying, given a full account of your submission in detail, and we're grateful for that, but there's a bonus in your reference to the Danish study, and describing that. And so that's, as it were, an extra for us. And so we're particularly grateful to you. Thank you very much for coming in and for taking all the trouble in presenting these slides and speaking to.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Now, I think the final submitter for the day is Sandra Stewart.
Commissioner Shepherd, she's just sitting down now.
Yes, that's fine, yes. Not rushing her. Good afternoon, Ms. Stewart.
Good afternoon.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your patience in waiting your turn. We have from you your original submission, and we have the newspaper material and what you've marked as your verbal submission. So how would you like to present? We've read what you've sent us, of course, and now it's your opportunity to present it as you would like.
Thank you for that. I don't intend to read what has ended up to be quite a copious document, but I will actually track through it and mention points that are important to me. Introducing myself to you, I'm a journalist by trade and a current Waimakariri District Councillor, and have represented the council on the zone committee for the past 4 years, and was part of the consultation and crafting of the zone implementation plan addendum, which I ended up voting against, as did the rest of my Kaiapoi councillors and Nai Tūhuriri Runanga, when it came to the vote in December 2018. The reason for that was that the zipper, which is obviously the base of this plan change, did not go far enough, fast enough for all of us who voted against it. So what, and an indication of that and how serious Runanga took the stance they made was that they asked also for withdrawal of their whakatauki, which prefaced the document, and that was the one that talks about for us and our future and our children. And they felt that the document did not reflect that. So what I'll do, and I take a different perspective from many of the submitters this afternoon, is really to go through and look at the river, the effects on the rivers and streams, and my take on how the community have seen what has happened to the northern Waimakariri rivers over the past 20, 30 years. I do want to state that I have a very warm embrace of the 2020 NPS freshwater, and my understanding is that this is to be given legal effect through this proposed plan change. To me, it's absolutely essential that, in fact, if we are to have the result of halting further degradation and improving water quality within 5 years, that an immediate consent review of the minimum flows and allocations is part and parcel of either the plan change constitutions itself or occurs immediately after the plan change becomes operative in order to achieve the fundamental and guiding principle of Te Mana o Te Wai in the essential freshwater package. The health and well-being of the significantly degraded receiving waters of the Kaiapoi River and tributaries, which is the Cam River and its brooks, Ahuka Stream, the Cuss Main Drain, which on the Lawa site is called the Cuss River, but in fact it is the Cuss Main Drain and its downstream reaches, and the Silver Stream, which is the Upper Kaiapoi River, is fundamental. These streams and rivers are the fundamental priority, from what I understand, in this plan change. Secondly comes the provision of safe drinking water for people and stock, and thirdly, the economic uses of this water, irrigation being the main example that you have plenty of evidence here today. While the general thrust of the plan change is certainly aimed at reducing nutrient and sediment flowing into the rivers, to halt further degradation in the time frame that is laid out in the MPS 2020 of a generation, which I translate as 25 years. Some families it might be lower than that. But certainly the plan change proposed timeframes of 60, 90 to 125 years plus will not achieve the reversal of the damage done to our waterways. And that is why I am requesting the relief in the immediate review of the water allocation and minimum flows. And while I acknowledge that significant land use change is required to achieve that, and I concede that tackling pollution by dilution is not a long-term solution, as I was told many decades ago. To my mind, if you want to achieve some significant water quality improvement within 5 years, this to me is the only mechanism we have available to achieve that. I do want to go through briefly some of the water quality analysis that the Lawa site affords us all, and in doing so really bring up the challenge that site puts before us, in that it is really an inconsistent hodgepodge patchwork of water quality data and ecological parameters, and it makes, because of that, and the fact that the latest information up there is December 2019, so almost 12 months out of date, it makes getting a comprehensive picture of what is happening across the northern Waimakariri extremely difficult. I'll just go through the four main tributaries. The Cam River, it has its ecology is rated at C on the National Objectives Framework at Bramley's Road. It has high bacterial contamination. Its 5-year median is 1173, and there is the conclusion being from the data there that this is a very degraded waterway. I just wanted to mention there that you've probably had submissions to the effect that the minimum flow proposed of remaining at 1,000 and moving up to 1.2 and then 1.4 QMEX is challenged. But to my mind, and of studies that have come before, if the Cam River is charged with healing itself from the degradation in the sewer effluent that was in it for 60 years, that in fact leaving more water in it to flush itself is an incredibly important move to make. The Cuss River, It's the Cuss main drain at the Lawa site at Stewart. Again, high nitrate, or total oxidised nitrogen, the worst 25% of rivers and degrading. Its MCI, again, 96.6 is only fair. Similarly, for upstream, where it is the Cuss River at Tippings Road, in the west of the district. Silver Stream at Harper's Road, that's the Upper Kaiapoi River. The worst 50% for faecal bacteria, hugely problematic nitrate levels, and the worst 25% of rivers nationally, and well exceeding the old MPS bottom line of 6.9 milligrams per litre, let alone the new MPS. And I mentioned some readings there when the total oxidised nitrogen in 2015 was up at 10.5 milligrams per litre. Downstream, again, Lawa measures only its ecology as fair and doesn't give any water quality data. Further downstream towards the Kaiapoi Town Centre at Island Road, again, it is a bacterial rating, worst 25% of rivers nationally, an NOF rating of D, and as you go further down, it is, as I've stated, still high nitrate levels. When the stream enters the Kaiapoi River at the Three Streams confluence, there are no further measurements of water quality or ecological measurements. There in the main stem of the Kaiapoi proper, there is a swimming site and water quality is taken there over summer. And I include a photo of which I took of the kids jumping off the William Street Bridge in my newspaper. So even though that stretch of river has, which is right in the middle of Kaiapoi, has a special status, a long-standing unsuitable for swimming notice, the kids in a hot summer's day still jump off the bridge into it. It has high fecal coliform as well as high nitrate, 2,420, its highest over the last 3 years. And ECAN, because it's a tidal river, until just this month, ECAN hasn't monitored it in any substantial way. Well, not at all, really. But for the zipper current state, there was a 7 milligram per litre plus nitrate level. The Ahoka Stream, which is the fourth significant tributary of the Kaiapoi River, upstream at Bradley's Road, again, fair, with an MCI of 85.5 and rated D on the NOF. Further downstream at Island Road, it is the Ahoka Stream is measured for its bacteria in the worst 25% of rivers and degrading, and again quite high nitrate level. This gives you a quick overview of the degraded state of these northern Waimakariri tributaries and the Kaiapoi River, which is the jewel in the crown, being the best river town in New Zealand according to the 2018 Kaiapoi Town Centre Plan, and I refer that both in the newspaper and my evidence in chief. Now I just want to go from the data to really what I call the community reaction to what has been part and parcel of people's lives in Kaiapoi for the past 20, 30, 40 years. I talk about the low flows in the story I've submitted to you, which has forced the 50-year-old Chinook salmon hatchery on the Silver Stream at Clarkville to relocate much of its $41 million business because the adult fish could not grow in the low oxygen, high temperature, high nitrate levels in that stretch of the Silver Stream. You'll probably note that the minimum flow on the Silver Stream is 600 litres per second. At the hatchery, talking to the manager of the salmon hatchery, he measured flows as low as 100 litres a second, just downstream of the hatchery, which meant, as I said, the fish couldn't get up, and they release a portion of wild fish down to go out to sea and to come back, and nor could they get down. And they was, he showed me there's a pool just downstream of the hatchery where they released them into the Silver Stream, and they were stuck. They were stuck in a deep pool because the rest of the river was too shallow for semi-adult fish to get down. The present minimum flow on the Silver Stream is measured at Neves Road, and you would have to question, like one of the farming, Saltwater Creek farming submission did, about whether this is a appropriate site for measurement, when in fact upstream the flow is far less, and crucially the flow is needed upstream. So that's one example of a loss to the community from this business that has been under different ownership. I think it was originally set up by Doc, the hatchery, but New Zealand Salmon Smolt have taken it, taken some of their rearing up to south of Ashburton, where equally they face high nitrate, but they've got a really good flow of water which doesn't drop when crucially they need it. The second example I want to talk about in the community is Michael Bate. Now, Michael Bate is a Kaiapoi resident who has been complaining about the death of the Kaiapoi River, the disappearance of aquatic life, weed beds, shrimps, invertebrates, and virtually all fish in the lower tidal reaches. He's grown into an outraged environmental activist, and comes along to the Water Zone Committee virtually every month to tell us, to document for us, if some of us didn't already know, the very, very sad, degraded state of the Kaiapoi River and some of its tributaries. He has a handwritten notebook of his fish sketches from the Kaiapoi River, which he's fished from childhood, a record going back almost 60 years. And in any one year as a kid, he had 5,000 fish he would catch. There is nothing like that in the river, which is a great tragedy. So originally, Michael and his and fellow fishers pointed the finger at the District Council and ECAN's aquatic weed spraying program for the demise of fish in the lower reaches of the Kaiapoi. But his concerns did prompt a study from ECAN, and that's the Lower Kaiapoi March 2018 report, which really pointed to the intrusion of salt from the Waimakariri. And again, in my view, it is a too low flow set by ECAN at the Waimakariri River Old Highway Bridge, which has a minimum flow of 41 cumex. And it would appear the sheer volume of water that was coming down the Waimakariri also attenuated the tidal effect up the Kaiapoi. Why this should be surprising when you think of the interconnection of this whole water system, I don't know, but it came as a surprise to some people. So now up the Kaiapoi, we've got resident salt there for far longer than anyone suspected, and going further up the river than anyone ever suspected. And that has changed the whole freshwater environment to one of a salt water, going that way, to a saltwater estuary. And if you have a look at the willows along the riverbank of the Kaiapoi, you'll see they're all dying, and that's evidence of the change of environment from fresh to salt water. Adrian Meredith's report described discovery of a very large a population of kākahi freshwater mussels when he was investigating the salt intrusion up the Kaiapoi River. And while they were out there, they gathered 50 of them in 25 minutes, one person. So a sizable population. They were all old, no young ones. So the large population of this unique native freshwater shellfish has not been successfully reproducing in recent years. Large numbers of dead shells in the riverbed. Adrian brought very large shells to the Kaiapoi Community Board to show us exactly what he was talking about, and said these were 50 to 60 years old. Now, I found the demise of this large population of native shellfish particularly poignant, not only because no one knew that they were there in the first place in the middle of the town centre, but nothing has been done since to help them survive. So the Kaiapoi community, Ngāi Tuahuriri and the river itself will likely lose another of its tango residents. I thoroughly support a more intensive monitoring program that is part and parcel of the new NPS to make sure that outcomes like this don't happen again. And I would welcome any suggestions on how we can ensure the survival of these mussels. I just talk about the South Brook. A Cam tributary was a discharge point for more than 60 years for sewage effluent from Rangiora, which polluted the Cam with sediment, faecal bacteria, nutrients, and the too low flow that remains in the river now of 1 cubic has been unable to shift the sediment, the legacy sediment that remains in that river system, even though since 2006 the sewage effluent has been discharged out to sea in the Waimakariri Eastern District's outfall. And also the Kaiapoi River has been the discharge point for Kaiapoi Woolen Mill's effluent when the mill was active, and various different freezing works charges over the last 40, 50, 60 years. Another example of the degradation of this river system is the State of the Takiwā 2012 report, which was an inaugural cultural health assessment undertaken by Mahanui Kurataio for Ngāi Tahu and Waimakariri District Council in July, August 2012. All 44 sites tested from the source to the sea along the Ruataniwha Cam River and its tributaries were polluted and were deemed unfit for gathering mahinga kai, primarily due to pollution from neighbouring land uses. As you may know, Tuahiwi is the centre of Ngāi Tuhuriri settlement on Maori Reserve 873, so highly significant area for Ngāi Tahu. The recommendations from this cultural health assessment, now almost 10 years old, have not been implemented in any comprehensive or planned manner. And I list there in my updated submission the recommendations. The goal, of course, here in this report and across the whole, the outcome that we want from PC7 is that in fact you restore water quality and the health of the stream to the point where Mahinga Kai thrives and can be safely gathered for all, which isn't the case at the moment. I have also chaired what is now the defunct Cam River Enhancement Subcommittee, which has come under the auspices of the new Land and Water Committee at Waimakariri District Council, which I chair. As the Environment Court back in 2001 required Waimakariri set up a fund for restoration of habitat and rehabilitation of the Cam River following all the decades of sewage effluent discharge into that river system. Now, over the years, that fund has sat ring-fenced and now totals $200,000. And while allocated, it remains largely unspent because we're still waiting the granting of the Waimakariri Maintenance and Minor Works consent from Environment Canterbury. There is some irony there. And this point too, the PC7 and the zipper talks about green consents, whereby if a party is wanting to do in-stream river rehabilitation works, that there is a fast-track system. This is our vehicle to do in-stream works on the Cam, and it has been held up for years and still is held up. So I just place that before you, saying that if we want people to put their hand up and do in-stream rehabilitation works, this sort of roadblock needs to be dealt to. So I embrace with warm open arms the MPS freshwater and the requirement to give primacy to the mana of the Kaiapoi River and its tributaries. These waterways have been good and generous servants to the town and district development for well over a century. It is now time to stop the usury and abuse, honour that contribution and give priority to their recovery, restoration of their mauri and ongoing well-being. And as I've said, I see the minimum flows and to increase the minimum flows throughout the catchment, leaving more water in the waterways and reducing abstraction allocations, especially for irrigation, which is at its peak in summer when the rivers and streams are particularly vulnerable. There's some good news there in that just at November the 2nd, ECAN's Principal Water Quality Scientist Adrian Meredith has now got some very fancy state-of-the-art gear that he is putting into the Kaiapoi River to continuously monitor nitrate, salinity, nutrients, clarity, temperature, dissolved oxygen and pH and recording, and there'll be monthly grab samples on phytoplankton, phosphorus and carbon. This is the first time this stretch of river has had any intensive monitoring in addition to the summer sampling for faecal bacteria. And within 12 months, so I'm told, ECAN should have enough data to benchmark the issues within this river, which of course is most welcome. I wanted to raise some questions about how minimum flows themselves are set. And I have a query about how the 7-day minimum annual low flow, mean annual low flow, for determining the minimum amount of water for ecological habitat in the waterway. How does this sit now with Te Mana o Te Wai, the fundamental and governing principle of the MPS? My contention is that...
I wonder if you'll allow me to interrupt you just for
Certainly.
For a question of planning, really. We're almost 5 to 5.
Yes, I don't have to read it, do I? No.
And And so if you would like more time, and we're very comfortable with that, you've got important issues to raise, then you could ask Ms. Fernando there to give you another slot for the completion of your material. But we don't want you to think that we're not wanting to hear the rest of it, but we're running out of time today.
Yeah, fair enough.
Since 10 o'clock.
Look, what I could do, because I probably don't have time to come back in your schedule either, is I'll take as read all this.
Well, we have read it all.
Yes, I know you have. Thank you.
But it's always good to have you presenting it.
Indeed, and I appreciate that opportunity. I do want to just quickly say I have problems with the way the 7-day mean annual low flow is set in the light of Te Mana o Te Wai, and I would be advocating a buffer on top of allowing 100% of what the minimum low flow, rather than as I said, a discounted percentage. So I leave that with you. I can go on to drinking water here now, and my evidence in chief talks about the concerns I have, not only with the District Council's community drinking water supplies, which under the science that ECAN has put before us, there are several of the schemes, including the supply to Rangiora and Kaiapoi, which will be exceeding half the MAV at certain points as the load in the post comes through. And so I'm supportive of a lower limit of 2.4 milligrams per litre in groundwater. Though I heard now we don't have any limit on that. I've taken it as read that what you want in surface water in fact applies to groundwater. And I would certainly support Christchurch City Council and Vicky Buck's submission. And I asked the question, why should an aquifer system itself, the towns of Kaiapoi and Rangiora and the whole district and Christchurch City, to be expected to wear these contaminated flows in their drinking water from farming practices on less than 200 farms upstream, intensified inappropriately on free-draining gravels? Particular concern, and I won't go into the nitrate, we've had plenty of that, and I'm interested to see what the outcome is whether in fact it's valid data or not. The concern I have in Waimakariri is that there is another 900 lots, 4 hectare lots, subdivided, ready to apply for building consents, in addition to the 2,500 odd lots that are included in ECAN's current state report. These already, it's problematic with these lots and their private water supplies, drinking contaminated, nitrate contaminated water. Another 900 that are already sitting there ready to have a building consent, will just add to that. And as I've set out here, even after 50 years of progressive nitrate reductions, and these studies exclude the 900, there will be 740 private wells that are over half the MAV, with a further 170 over the maximum allowable value. And it doesn't include, as I say towards the end, the extra 4 hectare lots going with private well supplies that may eventuate between now and when the Waimakariri proposed district plan becomes operative. If there is not immediate, it's planned to be notified early next year and could take another 2 years plus before becoming operative. I see this as a potential health crisis just waiting to happen. I can probably leave it there, which is the guts of what I would like to say, and just invite any questions that you might have.
Well, thank you indeed. Thank you for that. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions of Ms. Stewart?
One question, just reading your original submission, you raise a lot of issues, but it seems to me the only change you're asking us to make to the plan change relates to the review that you talk about on page 2 of your original submission, which you want the date to be brought forward from 2029. I assume you're there referring to policy 8438B.
Yep.
The staff have recommended to us that we change that date to 2026 instead of 2029. Does that satisfy your concern at all?
No, it needs to be immediate. The problems in this river system are too critical to go another 6 years. It's simply that, and I would expect...
No, I understand the reasons why. I just wanted a simple yes or no.
No.
So, thank you.
No, thank you.
That's all.
Thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
No, I have no questions, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Ms. Stewart, you told us at the start that you'd be giving us a different perspective on the rivers and what has happened to them, and you've done that with enthusiasm. And thank you very much for all the trouble you've taken to put it in writing and to present it orally as well, and we're very grateful to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity.
So we adjourn now, and we'll start again at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning with the submission of the Christchurch City Council.